Hey there, word nerds and phrase fanatics. Welcome back to another episode of Archives and Anchovies, the podcast about whatever it is I feel like talking about that week. I'm your host, James Coulon, and today we're diving into something that's going to make you rethink some of the casual phrases that you use all the time. They just kind of roll off your tongue, and you probably don't give them a second thought. You know, things like sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite, or break a leg. You say those things, you don't think about it, but I did. So let's buckle up and strap in because the origins of some of these phrases are absolutely bonkers. And some, they're actually downright creepy and scary. And yes, before you ask, we are going to talk about some phrases that do have some genuinely dark history. So if that worries you, it's probably a good thing to pass on this one because apparently our ancestors were pretty comfortable with mortality, bodily harm, and general spookiness. So grab your coffee, buckle your seatbelt if you're in your car, get comfortable, and let's unpack some of the weird, some of the wonderful, and some of the occasionally horrifying origins of phrases that we use every single day. To get us warmed up, let's start with something that's a little bit more lighthearted and a little more fun to ease us into this. It's also a delicious candy bar, Butterfingers. You drop your phone for the millionth time, like I do. I have an iPhone. It just falls. I don't know how it happens, but I just drop it. And someone could call me Butterfingers. Well, it makes sense, right? Butter, well, it's pretty slippery. If you've ever eaten something like corn on the cob, you know, you get butter on your hands, it's pretty slippery. But here's the thing this phrase actually comes from 1600s England. And it wasn't really about dropping things all the time at all. It was originally used to describe someone who couldn't hold onto a cricket ball. Yes, you could say that's dropping, but somebody that literally couldn't hold on to it. Just on a side note, the earliest recorded game of cricket was in 1550. And we know this actually from a court case with a date of 1598. But that court case is a whole other cool story that's for a different topic. Why butter specifically for Butterfingers? Well, in those days, butter was used as kind of a catch-all term for anything slippery or smooth. You've heard the term smooth as butter, but there's also a theory that it referred to people who literally had butter on their hands from eating, just like we were talking about the corn on the cob. That's honestly pretty relatable. The phrase, however, didn't really catch on in America until the 1800s when it shifted to mean anyone who drops things. So the next time you fumble your keys and you drop something on the ground repeatedly, you can blame cricket players from 4 centuries ago if someone calls you Butterfingers. Now, how about the term break a leg? I'm a performer. I've been playing music most of my life, and I have heard this phrase several times. People say break a leg. It seems super weird to me when I hear it, when you think about that. Hey, James, you're going on stage. How about you snap a major bone in your body? That would be pretty cool. I guess maybe in some weird way the audience might be entertained by that, but I highly doubt it. And, you know, there's actually several theories about this particular phrase. The most popular is that it comes from theater world, and it's a superstition that wishing someone good luck actually would bring them bad luck. So actors started saying kind of the opposite. It's like George Costanza in Seinfeld. He's doing the opposite. It's like reverse psychology for the universe. My personal favorite theory, though, is that it might come from the literal action of bending your knee or actually breaking your leg to bow or curtsy after a performance. So break a leg could mean, I hope you do so well that you get a standing ovation and you get to take a bow. There's one additional theatrical theory that is actually pretty interesting as well. In the old days, actors who weren't in a particular scene or maybe not even in the performance at all, they would wait in the wings, which were actually called legs. They were the side curtains, and they concealed them from the audience. If you broke the leg line, meaning you stepped past the curtain and actually onto the stage, it meant you were actually going to be performing and you were getting paid for that show and not just sitting in the dressing room or on the side stage. So break a leg could actually mean, I hope you actually get to perform, or I hope you get cast. That's another theory that I've heard as well, that somebody says break a leg because you also get to the cast. And there's one more darker theory involving understudies that hoped that the lead actor would actually break their leg so that they would go on instead. But I like to think that theater people aren't quite as vicious as maybe ice skaters, if you know the Tanya Harding story. Maybe that's not the case at all. I don't know. But either way, it's a phrase born entirely from theatrical superstition and tradition, which makes sense given how notoriously superstitious theater and performers are. Like, you don't say Macbeth, you don't whistle backstage, and you definitely don't wish someone good luck when they're about to take the stage. Another phrase that is typically said all the time is, it's a piece of cake. The phrase meaning for this one means something easy, that it was very easy to do. But it has a more complex origin than you think, and it involves a couple of theories, both in the American South and in the Royal Air Force. The connection to cake being easy starts with cakewalks in the mid 1800s. These were dance competitions where enslaved people would perform elaborate, high stepping dances that subtly mocked the stiff, formal mannerisms of plantation owners and their fancy balls. The most graceful couple would actually win a cake as a prize. The slave owners apparently didn't realize that they were being mocked, and they actually enjoyed watching these performances. So for the performers, winning the cake was seen as relatively easy. So thus it was a cakewalk, and it became associated with something simple to accomplish. But the specific phrase piece of cake didn't really show up in print until much later. American poet Ogden Nash first used it in a 1936 work entitled The Primrose Path, writing, and quote, her picture's in the paper now, and life is a piece of cake. Then the phrase really exploded in popularity during World War II, thanks to the British Royal Navy Air Force pilots. They'd use the term piece of cake to describe missions that went smoothly. They didn't have complications, probably didn't get shot down. And, these were classic British understatements. Oh, shooting down that enemy aircraft, that was a piece of cake, old chap. That was not a very good English accent. I can do better if I'd practiced, but you get the idea. So this phrase has a journey from a plantation competition to fighter pilot slang, which is really quite the evolution if you think about it. Though honestly, the RAF origin is a lot cheerier than some of the things that we're about to get into, so prepare yourself. This is where it might get a little bit weird. And entering the zone where things get stranger, we have Saved by the Bell. You'd think this comes from boxing, right? Boxers getting pummeled, he's getting beat, the bell rings, the round's over, he's saved, yay. Makes perfect sense. Well, that would be completely wrong. Or at least, that's not where it originally came from. And no, it's also not some cheesy 90s teen sitcom starring Zach Morris. That would be, honestly, a lot less disturbing, though, than the origin story. This phrase actually has a much, much darker origin, and it's going to set the tone for the rest of this episode. In the 1700s and 1800s, people were absolutely terrified of being buried alive. And honestly, that's a valid concern. Who wouldn't be? Medical science at that point in time, it wasn't great. And people had a lot of illness, and sometimes they fell into comas that were not explained, and people looked like they were dead. So what they did is they invented these things called safety coffins, and they had bells attached to strings that ran down into the coffin when you were buried. If you woke up 6 feet under, you could actually ring this bell, and someone keeping watch in the graveyard would dig you up. You were literally saved by the bell. They also had flags, and they also, in some of these, had breathing tubes as backup systems. There was a person who had the overnight graveyard shift to listen for bells, and that person, as you can imagine, is working the graveyard shift. Yeah, that phrase comes from this too. And if someone had a particularly rough day, and they were actually in a coffin and had to ring a bell, if they were in a coma, guess what they looked like? They looked like death warmed over. Because, well, you can imagine being in a coffin for a few hours to maybe a day, and you would look pretty bad too. So, sweet dreams on that one. Another phrase that has probably gone a little away in recent times, but bite the bullet is something that was said quite a bit. Just bite the bullet and do it. This means to endure something unpleasant with courage. The origin, however, is based on medical procedures during war. Before anesthesia was widely available, if a soldier needed emergency surgery on the battlefield, they'd give him a bullet to bite down on. It served a couple of different purposes. One, it gave them something to focus on besides the pain. It also prevented them from biting off their own tongue or perhaps breaking their teeth from clenching too hard. Now, you could still do that on a bullet, but you wouldn't destroy all of your teeth, hopefully. So when you tell someone to bite the bullet about, say, finally organizing their closet, or having that weird, awkward conversation with a friend, you're actually referencing Civil War era field surgery when you say that. So, kind of puts things in perspective if you think about it. Another phrase that we use a lot is the cold shoulder. When someone gives you a cold shoulder, they're being deliberately unwelcoming or dismissive. I think everybody in their lifetime has probably had this happen to them by someone that they've met. And the origin here is actually kind of culinary. Culinary depends on where you're at in the country. In medieval England, when you had welcome guests, you'd actually serve them a nice, hot, fresh meal, probably a nice roast of some sort. You laid out the good wine, you had all kinds of stuff for them. But if you had an overstayed guest or somebody that was unwanted, you'd serve them cold shoulder of mutton, basically leftover meat that was past its prime. It was a not so subtle hint that they weren't welcome and you should probably leave. Imagine being so passive aggressive back then that it creates a phrase that lasts 500 plus years. The Brits, they really have perfected the art of polite hostility. And here is where we're about to get properly dark. The term kick the bucket. This means to die, of course, as we know today. And while there's a lot of competing theories, none of them are cheerful at all. They're just downright dreadful. The most widely accepted origin is genuinely grim. It refers to the bucket or beam that someone would stand on before they were going to be hanged. When the bucket was kicked away, or when the person had a final involuntary spasm, well, you get the picture. They would kick the bucket. Another theory says that it comes from the way that pigs were slaughtered back in the day. They'd be hung upside down from a beam called a bucket, and their death throes would cause them to kick. So, yeah, this is definitely not about someone accidentally knocking over their mop bucket while they're trying to clean the floor. Sorry to disappoint you with that. About the term meet the deadline. Okay, this one is one of the darkest ones, and it's about to make your work emails a lot more sinister. When your boss at work tells you, hey, we need to meet the deadline, and you need to put in some extra work and you need to do the things, they're using a phrase that actually comes from the American Civil War, specifically from a prisoner of war camp. At the infamous Andersonville prison in Georgia, there was a line marked in the dirt. It was approximately 19 feet from the prison walls. This line was called the deadline. If any prisoner crossed it, guards had orders to shoot them on sight, no questions asked, no warnings given. Cross the deadline and you're dead, hence the term deadline. The line existed to keep prisoners from getting close enough to the walls to attempt escape, but it meant that prisoners had to constantly be aware of this literal line drawn in the dirt, and this line was the line between life and death. Some historians believe that disoriented, sick, or possibly mentally unstable prisoners would accidentally cross it and be killed. The conditions at Andersonville were so horrific. They had overcrowding, they had starvation, disease, and yes, this deadline. And after the war, the commandant, Captain Henry Wurz, was convicted of war crimes. He himself was actually executed in November of 1865, becoming one of only a handful of people executed for war crimes after the Civil War. The deadline specifically, well, it was cited in his trial of one of the atrocities he'd overseen. So yeah, the phrase has literal war crime origins. That really puts your quarterly report deadline into perspective, doesn't it? And after the war, the term actually stuck around in American English, but the meaning shifted. Thankfully, it doesn't necessarily mean, what it meant back then. Instead of a line that you couldn't cross without dying, it became a time limit that you shouldn't or couldn't exceed without consequences. It's much less fatal. Presumably, though, some bosses might disagree. I don't know. It could be fatal to your career if you miss a bunch of deadlines, but it's not going to be fatal to you in the same context. So the next time you're rushing to meet a deadline at work, just remember, at least nobody's going to shoot you for missing it. Probably. And you're definitely not going to face war crime charges over it. The phrase is a reminder, however, that so much of our language has military and violent origins. Even the stuff we use in boring office contexts might have strange origins. Your project timeline has roots in Civil War prison camps. So sleep tight on that one. So now we're going to move into something that maybe is not quite as gruesome, but maybe more into a little bit of the creepy territory. If you're listening to this at night, maybe turn on a light or something because, this might get a little strange. A, a dead ringer is someone who looks exactly like someone else. You might hear, wow, you're a dead ringer for your grandmother. But why dead ringer? Why not just ringer? Well, this goes back to our friends with their burial paranoia. Remember those strange safety coffins that they could ring bells? Well, the bells, they weren't foolproof. Sometimes condensation or shifting soil would ring the bell, even though the person was definitely and they were completely dead. This was called a dead ringer. The phrase actually evolved to mean an exact duplicate because, well, imagine, let's say you're one of the people digging up a coffin because the bell rang. So you do the 6 feet of dirt and you do all this work only to find out the person's definitely still dead. They looked exactly as they did when you buried them a day ago, 2 days ago. They're a dead ringer for themselves. Alternatively, some etymologists think that it comes from horse racing, where a ringer was a horse that was substituted for another in a race for betting fraud purposes. A dead ringer would be a perfect match for the horse that it was getting replaced. But I kind of prefer the creepy graveyard explanation. I think it's more entertaining. And you know what? Since this is my podcast, I'm going to stick with that one because I think it's cooler. Another phrase about sleeping is sleep tight. We've all heard, good night, sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite. It's kind of cute. We say it to our kids, right? Nope, wrong. In the olden days, we're talking 16th and 17th centuries, mattresses weren't the nice spring or foam situations we have now. They were fabric sacks and they were filled with straw or sometimes feathers. And they weren't supported by metal frames, they were supported by ropes woven across the frame. These ropes would sag over time, just as ropes do, and they would make the bed a more uncomfortable sleep. You had to regularly tighten them to get a good night's sleep, hence, sleep tight. It was literal instructions. Make sure your bed ropes are tight, and you'll sleep well. And yes, bed bugs were absolutely a problem too, which is where the second part of that phrase comes from. People would literally have to worry about bugs in the straw or the feathers and all the stuff that they had in their mattresses. So that adorable children's rhyme is actually about furniture maintenance and in some cases pest control. You're welcome for ruining that one forever. Sorry about that. So speaking of sleeping, what about the term nightmare? Let's talk about that word. What does that term mean? How did it come about? You probably think it's just a bad dream at night, right? Nope. The mare part of this has nothing to do with horses. It comes from Mara, an Anglo-Saxon term for a malicious female spirit or goblin that would literally sit on your chest while you slept, causing bad dreams, sleep paralysis, and difficulty breathing. The nightmare was literally believed to be a demon that attacked you in your sleep. Different cultures had different names for this individual. In Newfoundland, she was the old hag. In Turkish folklore, the Karabasan, but the experience was the same. You wake up, unable to move, feeling pressure on your chest, and sometimes seeing a dark figure in the room. Now, we know modern science tells us this is sleep paralysis, a real phenomenon where your brain wakes up, but your body is still in REM sleep paralysis. So we can explain it now, but for thousands and thousands of years, people believed in actual entity was attacking them, and that gave the term nightmare. So when you say you have a nightmare, you're referencing an ancient demon folklore. So as I keep saying, everybody should sleep well tonight, knowing all of these cool things about what we used to do for sleep. How about the term mad as a hatter? This one is very, very dark, and it's going to make you feel really bad for hat makers. When someone says they're mad as a hatter, you're acting crazy or irrational or just, being a basic spaz. You might think it comes from Mad Hatter and Alice in Wonderland, but Lewis Carroll was actually referencing a real phenomenon. In the 18th and 19th centuries, hat makers, especially those making felt hats, used mercury in the hat making process. They'd use mercury nitrate to treat animal furs and turn them into felt. Sounds great. Sounds fine. It's what they did at the time, right? No, wrong. Mercury is incredibly toxic, as we now know. Hat makers would breathe in mercury vapors day after day, year after year, and this led to mercury poisoning, which caused tremors, mood swings, irritability, and yes, legitimate neurological damage that made people appear mad. Symptoms included shaking, slurred speech, memory loss, depression, hallucinations. It was called Mad Hatter Syndrome or erethism. These weren't people being quirky or eccentric. They were literally being poisoned by their profession. So when you call someone mad as a hatter, you're referencing an entire industry of workers who were slowly driven insane by toxic chemical exposure. The phrase is actually really tragic when you know the backstory because that's just horrible. Carol's Mad Hatter wasn't just whimsical, it was social commentary on a real occupational hazard. It's pretty heavy for a children's book. How about the term break the ice? This one seems innocent enough, not as bad as Mad Hatter's disease. Break the ice means to initiate conversation or ease tension in a social situation. The origin, though, is a little bit darker than what you would do talking at a cocktail party and making small talk. It likely comes from special ships called icebreakers that would forge paths through frozen waters for other ships to follow. If they couldn't break the ice, ships would get stuck and crews would die. But there's an even more interesting maritime origin. In the days before modern ships, vessels would sometimes get trapped in ice. To free them, some smaller boats would literally have to break the ice around the ship, an extremely, extremely dangerous but crucial job. So breaking the ice wasn't about making friends comfortable, it was more about survival than anything else. Though I suppose at parties, some people do feel like social situations are life and death, so maybe it does still apply today. There is still a hard job to go make that first connection. So let's talk about phrases involving body parts next. Heck, why not? We've already talked about sleep. We've talked about, death and graveyards. So apparently our ancestors also were pretty focused on anatomical references. The term chip on your shoulder. Having a chip on your shoulder means holding a grudge or being quick to take offense of something, like you're looking for a fight. Now, the origin of this one is actually pretty heavily debated, and I love when phrases in doing this research they had competing origin stories because it shows how language spreads and evolves across different countries and different communities and different nations. The most commonly cited origin, however, is from the 19th century America, particularly in shipyards and lumber towns. If a young man wanted to prove how tough he was, he literally would place a wood chip on his shoulder and dare someone to knock it off. Go ahead, knock this chip off my shoulder. I dare you, they would say. If someone did, that was an invitation to fight. The phrase actually appears in American newspapers as early as 1830, and it was particularly common among working class men looking basically to prove their toughness. But and here's where it kind of gets interesting. Some etymologists argue it actually may have started in Scotland and have Scottish origins that predate the American usage. In Scotland, there was supposedly a tradition where apprentice carpenters would carry chips of wood on their shoulders as they left work, showing that they had actually completed their day's labor. If someone knocked it off, it was seen as disrespectful to their craft and their work. There's also a theory about Scottish shipwrights carrying wood chips to show they were legitimate workers and challenging anyone who questioned their status. The truth is, we don't really know, and we're not entirely sure which one came first, or if maybe these completely developed independently either. It's possible the phrase existed in both cultures and the meanings emerged over time as Scottish immigrants came to America. Either way, American lumberjacks or Scottish carpenters, the image is pretty much the same. Someone literally walking around with a piece of wood on their shoulder, just daring you to give them an excuse for a confrontation. It's definitely peak masculinity at its finest. How about the term costs an arm and a leg? When something is super expensive, we say it costs an arm and a leg. The origin story that people love to share is that it comes actually from portrait painting. Artists would charge you more if you wanted your arms and legs included in the portrait. If you notice that some of the old portraits, they were just busts, so they're kind of the neck up of somebody's face. And if you wanted to have something more than that, they may charge you more to do that below your shoulders. That's kind of a cute story, but it's probably not true. The phrase actually doesn't appear until the 1940s, well after portrait pricing worked that way. The real origin is likely much simpler. It's a post World War II American slang. It emphasized that something is so expensive, you'd have to give up your limbs to afford it. It's hyperbole, of course, and it emerged when a lot of soldiers were actually coming home having lost limbs in the war, which makes it a bit darker when you think about that. Something else that has to do with anatomy is the rule of thumb. Here's a controversial one. Rule of thumb means a general principle of or a rough guideline, right? There's a persistent myth that this comes from an old English law allowing a man to beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb. That story is almost certainly false, as there's no such evidence that a law ever existed. It's kind of just a rumor. The real origin story is probably much more practical and boring. Craftsmen, builders, and brewers would use their thumb as a rough measuring tool. Your thumb from the first knuckle to tip is roughly about an inch, and it was a handy, yes, pun intended, way to make quick estimates. So you can use this phrase without guilt. It's about carpentry, not domestic violence. Though, if anyone tries to tell you the wife beating story at a party, you can now correct them with authority, and you can tell them that they're caught red handed. Caught red handed is another one of those phrases, and it means being caught in the act of doing something wrong with clear evidence. The red refers to blood. Specifically, this phrase comes from 15th century Scotland, where if you were found with blood on your hands after a murder or poaching, you were literally caught red-handed, with the blood still fresh on your hands as proof of your crime. Later, this phrase actually expanded to any crime where evidence was obvious and it was actually pretty immediate. But the origin is definitely about being caught with blood on your hands, which is pretty metal for a phrase that we use about like someone stealing cookies today. How about give the cold shoulder? Wait, I think we already covered this one, didn't we? Yeah, but you know what? I want to add something creepy. While the cold mutton theory is mostly accepted, there's also a Scottish variation that's a little bit darker. In medieval Scotland, there was supposedly a tradition where if you wanted someone dead, you could serve them a cold shoulder of meat as a death threat, a warning that you wanted them gone. This is possibly apocryphal, but it adds a nice sinister layer to what we discussed earlier. Imagine you're being served leftovers and having to wonder, is this just bad hospitality or is this a death threat? Medieval life back then, it was very stressful, everyone. It just was a crazy time. And, getting into crazy time, let's just end with some phrases that are just weird. Not necessarily scary, they're just bizarre. The whole 9 yards. When you give something the whole 9 yards, you're giving it everything, holding nothing back or giving it your all. The origin of this phrase is genuinely disputed, and we might actually never know for sure. There's several theories, and they include the length of ammunition that is in a World War II fighter plane, the belts that hold the ammunition. It's the amount of fabric needed for a very large person to make them a kill. It's also the capacity of cement mixer trucks and the length of burial shrouds. There's that death theme again. Nobody knows. It's a phrase everyone uses, but etymologists are still arguing about where it came from. Sometimes language is just chaos, and we have to accept that. How about barking up the wrong tree? This one is actually pretty straightforward and kind of delightful. It comes from hunting dogs in early America. Dogs, well, they would chase raccoons or other small animals. And these critters, well, they're running for their lives, so they run up trees. The dogs would bark at the base of a tree to alert the hunters, but these animals, they're not dumb. They would sneak to different tree while the dog wasn't looking. So the dog, well, it literally would be barking up the wrong tree. Makes sense, right? It's one of the few phrases where the literal origin and the figurative meaning are pretty much the same. So when you're barking up the wrong tree, you're pursuing the wrong course of action or making a false assumption, just like that confused hunting dog, and sometimes like this podcast. So how about spill the beans? Spill the beans means to reveal a secret, right? We probably all know that person that you've told a secret to, and they've spilled the beans. The origin story that often is shared comes from ancient Greece. People would vote by putting beans in jars, white beans for yes, black beans for no. If someone knocked over the jar before the vote was actually counted, they'd spill the beans and reveal the results early. That's a great story, but there's not much evidence for it from that long ago. The phrase doesn't even appear in English until early 1900s in America, where it was slang that probably just referred to accidentally knocking over a container of beans, which people they kept in bulk and causing a mess, thus revealing what you had. Sometimes the boring explanation is the true one, but to be honest, I like the Greek voting story better, so let's just pretend. Again, this is my podcast. If you want to start your own and disagree with me, that's totally fine too. How about raining cats and dogs? When it's raining heavily, we say, it's raining cats and dogs. Why? Nobody really knows. Here's a couple theories. In olden days, animals would actually hide in thatched roofs for warmth, and heavy rain would dislodge them, making them fall. So it would literally rain cats and dogs. It's a corruption of the Greek word katadou, meaning waterfall. In Norse mythology, cats were associated with rain, and dogs, they were associated with wind. It's just nonsense that sounds funny that the thatch roof theory is almost certainly false. Animals falling from rooftops isn't something probably that was commonly documented, but it's good mental image, and I wanted to share it. The truth is, the phrase probably just emerged because it's absurd and vivid. Sometimes language is just people being creative and using exaggeration. So, language is funny. And there you have it. This was a journey through the weird, wonderful, and occasionally disturbing origins of phrases that we sometimes use without thinking. From safety coffins to bed maintenance, from cold mutton to mysterious beans, our language, it's packed with history that ranges from the mundane to the macabre. The next time someone tells you to sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite, or says something's going to cost you an arm and a leg, you can now horrify them with your knowledge, and I urge you to do so. You're welcome for that. Or, I'm sorry if they don't get it either. Either way, both's appropriate. So what's really fascinating is that we keep these phrases long after the original contexts have disappeared. Nobody's worried about being buried alive anymore, mostly, I don't think. We don't sleep on rope beds very often, and we don't vote with beans. Maybe we should, who knows? But the language persists. It's like linguistic fossils, little remnants of how our ancestors lived, the things that they feared and worried about, and what they found important enough to turn into sayings that would last for centuries. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into these phrase origins, let me know. Leave a comment. Follow the podcast. There's 100 more where these came from. And I do have a list of even weirder ones we didn't even get to. Did I miss a favorite quote or phrase of yours? Do you know any origin story that I got wrong? Well, I'd love to hear about it. Please leave a comment and let me know. Until next time, this is Archives and Anchovies. I'm your host, James Coulon. If you're going to bed, I hope you're sleeping on a modern mattress with no ropes. And whatever you do, don't kick the bucket before the next episode. As always, I want to wish you a great day, a wonderful evening, and a fantastic week ahead. Thank you.